Since its founding, Cornell has maintained partnerships with and cultivated profits through fossil fuels, land grabs, and capitalist oppression. Those oppressively empty seats behind us are a tangible reminder that every single degree that Cornell has ever conferred has been drenched in oil, gas, land grabs, and capitalist extraction. Kevin Young, who's here, is a professor of history at UMass Amherst and the author of Abolishing Fossil Fuels. And his work really defies convention. Today, Kevin Young will combine historical and current day analysis to shed light on our current moment of repression, retrenchment, greenwashing, and backtracking pledges. He will speak to authoritarianism, racial oppression, class struggle, and international solidarity, and the possibilities for leverage in our current moment, including direct action as one form of disruption that's needed. Bill McKibben, the screen behind me, is the Sean Distinguished Scholar at Middlebury College in Vermont, the founder of Third Act and 350.org. He's a scholar activist organizing scale activism, including simultaneous mass coordinated protests that span the globe and were visible from space. Professor McKibben will join us virtually right now. Let's turn down the lights. And hear from Dr. McKibben.
Well, hello, friends at Cornell. Very good to be with you. Greetings from across the border in the Green Mountain state of Vermont. I bet it's almost as pretty in the gorgeous Ithaca as it is in the mountains here today. And I hope that this is, if nothing else, a beautiful spring to provide a little solace for our woes otherwise. Another thing that will provide some solace is taking the action that we can and should take to try and disrupt business as usual with the fossil fuel industry. Let's think for a minute about where we are. 2023, 2024, and now 2025 have seen month after month when every month we've set a new record for the hottest March, the hottest August, the hottest October ever on record. We're now seeing temperatures on this planet higher, not that they've been in the years that we've been measuring, higher than they've been, the paleoclimatologists tell us, in at least the last 125,000 years. Temperatures high enough that they're beginning to disrupt the safe operation of the jet stream and of the Gulf Stream. The most basic physical forces on our planet are beginning to flicker and to falter in the face of the carbon that we're pouring into the atmosphere. So you would think it would be a very good time to stand up to the fossil fuel industry and demand that they change their business model, especially since in the last 3 or 4 years, we have reached a point where we know how to make energy more cleanly and more cheaply than by burning coal and gas and oil. We live on a planet where the cheapest way to make power is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. And the second cheapest way is to take advantage of the fact that the sun differentially heats the earth, producing the winds that turn those majestic turbines. So it's not that we don't have any choice. It's that the fossil fuel industry and its allies at places like TIAA are just too addicted to their business model. And that's not okay. Look, I'm a professor. I know my colleagues here at Middlebury, and I know faculty all over the country because I travel constantly to college campuses, hither and yon. I've had many happy memories at Cornell and at Ithaca College. I think almost without exception, nobody envisions that their retirement savings are being used to prop up the industry that's making the whole idea of retirement laughable. You can't retire without a planet to retire on. We're in the business of educating young people, but if we are making the planet that they will inherit pointless, And shame on us. I mean, look, if we don't get climate change under control quickly, then it doesn't matter what you're studying right now, economics or accounting or theology or psychology or sociology or whatever it is. By the time you're my age, your job's going to be disaster response, because that's what everyone's job's going to be. And we don't want that to happen. We want to cut that short. That can only happen if we make the rapid transition off fossil fuel and onto renewable energy. The fossil fuel industry stands in the way of that. They stand in the way of that by continuing to promote their business model. They stand in the way of that by endlessly lobbying and paying huge sums of money to the campaigns of politicians who will protect them. And important to note for colleges and universities, they stand in the way of that transition by, for 40 years, lying about the impact of fossil fuels. We now know that these companies knew everything there was to know about climate change back in the 1980s, and knew it and believed it. Exxon started building drilling rigs higher then to compensate for the rise in sea level they knew was coming. The only thing they didn't do was tell the rest of us. In fact, just the opposite. If that happened with a student or a professor, that kind of cheating, well, they'd be kicked out, and well, they should. That's intellectual dishonesty. And if there's anything that universities should stand for, it's opposition to intellectual dishonesty. That's kind of our calling card. So for myriad reasons, it really is time for TIAA to just bite the bullet and say, we're joining the future, not any longer trying to defend the past. You guys have a big part in helping make that happen. And I'm extremely grateful. I'm extremely grateful for all the work that Cornell has done over the years on things like fossil fuel divestment, and on its own approaches, some of the time anyway, to energy there on campus. We've got to go much further and much faster, and we can. We're on the edge of a remarkable shift. Some of us are gearing up for Sun Day in September 20th or 21st on the equinox, which will be a big celebration of renewable energy all over the country and all over the world. It'll be great if Cornell and TIAA could mark that day by getting out of the global warming business and getting into the solutions business. Thank you all very much.
Okay, please welcome.
It's on. My voice is coming through a little bit. Maybe the wind turning up here. Right. Hello, everyone. It's good to be here. It's an honor to follow Bill McKibben. It's an honor to be here at Cornell and in Ithaca, where there are so many people working to confront the climate emergency. The people here doing this work have been an inspiration to me as I've watched a little bit from afar, and I know that you're doing a lot of really good and essential work at some times which are very difficult. I'm not going to talk much about the current U.S. political scene. I don't think I need to go into detail about that, but the federal government has unleashed an all-out war on virtually every sector of the population, both here and abroad. Now, the worst of its crimes is a little bit less visible to most people, I think, and that's the effort to maximize the burning of fossil fuels. The Trump administration's plan will take us far beyond the 1.5 degree, within the 2 degree Celsius threshold that scientists have identified for us to stay within. And the government has essentially abandoned all pretense of caring all about that. A little bit less obvious, though, is less visible anyways, is the way that so many institutions which have liberal or moderate or centrist reputations are effectively collaborating with the Trump administration's agenda. So here I'm talking about the banks, the corporations, the major universities like mine and yours that are quietly abandoning all talk of decarbonization, right? All talk of going zero carbon by 2050. So one institution after another has started to drop the pretense of caring. We get one indication of this from the country's leading foreign policy think tank, the Council on Foreign Relations. A few weeks ago, they launched an initiative called Climate Realism. And the director of the initiative describes and calls the need for a fresh approach to climate policy. Right? So what he means by a fresh approach is one that dispenses with all pretext, dispenses with all concern for limiting the amount of heating due to carbon pollution. Right? And he says, in a straightforward way, we need to prepare for 3 degrees Celsius heating. So, and that's climate realism. And the CFR is known generally as a more or less sensible, mainstream, bipartisan kind of organization. We're not talking about psychopaths in the Trump administration. You're talking about mainstream institutions. And this is essentially the path that my institution and yours and so many other major institutions in our country have casually and quietly adopted, casually decided from the comfort of their air-conditioned suites that the world is going to heat by perhaps 3 degrees Celsius or more. Right? So they are consigning the entire population of the world, most all future generations, to a future of misery and death. So the collaborationism of these liberal and centrist institutions is essential to the fossil fuel industry's long-term fate. That's the first point I really want to make about this. It's not just Trump. It's not just the fossil fuel executives. The collaborationism of these other institutions and companies and banks is essential. By the same token, if they were to take strong, aggressive action right now to decarbonize, they could actually get us most of the way there, even in the absence of the federal government doing what it should be doing. So the goal of these institutions, which are currently quietly collaborating and surrendering to a future of unchecked global heating, is essential. Now, what does 2 or 3 degrees Celsius actually mean? Those are abstractions. In 2023, there was a study published in the journal Energies, and it calculated that with 2 degrees Celsius of heating, that's going to mean about 1 billion people dead. How do we even find the language to describe that level of violence and evil? 1 billion. The old saying goes, 1 death is a catastrophe, 1 million deaths is a statistic. Here we're talking about 1,000 times that. So it's an incomprehensible figure. At 3 degrees Celsius, every little bit matters. At 3 degrees Celsius, the death toll goes up to somewhere between 2 and 3 billion. That's over a third of the current global population. To put that number in a little bit of perspective, you take World War II and the Holocaust together, multiply it by about 35 or 40, and that's what we're talking about. And this is, it's important to remember here that all of this is being done knowingly, and it's completely unnecessary given the resources and powers that we have access to. So I start on this belief note, because I think it's important to begin the discussion clear-eyed and by facing the situation that we are in. Outside of this room, the truth of the matter is that most people in our society are not alarmed or freaked out enough. Probably not true for those of us here. 2/3 of the U.S. public, according to a poll last year, rarely or never discusses climate change. So we need to be very clear about what the reality is and what the implications are. Now, this terrifying picture is not the whole story. And this is the other thing that I really want to emphasize, is that the fossil fuel companies and their enablers are still vulnerable. They were vulnerable before Trump was inaugurated, and they still are. They're vulnerable because the White House and Congress and the Supreme Court are not the only major centers of power in our society. So some of the other power centers are those collaborators that I was talking about before. Cornell University, UMass Amherst, my university, major corporations, the insurance companies, the state and local governments. So those alternative power centers can get us most of the way toward the carbon decarbonization goal that we have. And so in the time that remains, I want to try to identify what some of their vulnerabilities are and how they link to depression. Now, to begin, if we go back to Trump's first term, one of the lesser appreciated aspects of his first term is he, of course, came into office promising to revive the coal industry. In fact, over the 4 years of his presidency, the coal industry declined faster than in any 4-year period in U.S. history. Right? Actually, in world history, more coal-fired power plant capacity was retired between 2017 and 20 than in any other 4-year period. Yes, and so why? Right? Well, the commonly cited factors, the factors that the New York Times here chooses to emphasize, are the market forces. And this has had a lot to do with it, the boom in natural gas and then later on renewables. The market shift has played a significant role, but the movement has also played an essential role. The market shift is not all that's going on here. And when I say the movement, I'm really talking not so much about the big green organizations, but I'm talking about hundreds of local and state level organizations that are doing the essential organizing work to cancel plans to build power plants, and they have canceled well over 100 over the past quarter century, and then to retire those plants ahead of schedule. And so they've done this with a few different tactics. They've launched lawsuits often against regulators, state regulators, local regulators, to prevent coal plant construction. They engage in direct action protests against these plants. And they fight financial institutions as well, especially the banks and the insurance companies, which play an essential enabling or collaborating role with the coal industry. Now, the movement has also achieved some victories against oil and gas, although not quite as stark as in the case of coal. This is another graph a graphic that the New York Times published recently that shows the uneven nature of coal's decline around the United States. And I think that if you scrutinize this map carefully, you can see how much regional variation there is. And you can begin to appreciate the role for local organizers, local resistance movements that take on the coal industry. Because in places like Wyoming, for example, center of coal production, of course, but the movement there is also weaker than in other places. Also going back to Trump's first term, we look at the expansion of renewables. More wind power capacity in the United States was installed under Trump than under any other president, right, including Biden. So the president is not the only decision making here, neither is Congress or the Supreme Court. And there are other power centers at play here. Which means that even when the electoral terrain is hostile to us, deeply hostile to this currently, we do still have other points of leverage and places where the movement can have an impact. And by the way, if you ask polluters about their dissatisfaction with Trump's first term, they usually give credit to the movement. You look in their journals, the pipeline and gas and oil industry journals that they talk about how frustrated and worried they are about the growth of resistance, legal resistance, and extralegal resistance. Now, we're in the second Trump term, and things are different, of course. Things are primarily worse than they were before. The fossil fuel industry, again, has direct control over huge portions of the U.S. state apparatus. And we really don't know what's going to happen over the next few years. We're beginning to get some sense. But the fact remains, we don't live under a fascist state. Certainly not yet. Even if we classify Trump and his team as fascists, and I think there's a good argument for doing that, there's a very important difference with the classic fascists. A couple of important differences. One is that they have not seized control over the entire state. There are big portions of the government at all levels, especially at the state and local levels, and in parts of the federal and regional judiciary, that they do not control. You can see their frustration about that recently. Secondly, they don't have the ability to command capital. They don't have the degree of control over capital investments that the classic fascists like Hitler and Mussolini had, which means that business retains the power to discipline the Trump administration. They've begun to exercise that power in the case of the whole conflict over tariffs and a few other things. We have seen an escalation of repression against all our movements, especially the Palestine Solidarity Movement, but the climate movement as well, and increasingly any other forms of organized dissent. So in this context, we do need to take this repression seriously. We do need to think carefully about our tactics. But we can't retreat and abstain from protest or civil disobedience simply because the repression has escalated. We have to continue thinking about what we can do to disrupt polluters. And we do have to keep in mind, I think, that what's disruptive is not always obvious. So what is more disruptive, vandalizing a pipeline or getting your city council to boycott fossil fuels? It's not immediately obvious which form of activism is, in fact, more disruptive to the industry, because that's what we're talking about. We have to cause long-term disruption to the industry, meaning the flow of investments into that industry, into the production, transport, burning of fossil fuels. Now, we will face repression, but on this note, I think it's important to recognize that social movements throughout U.S. history and certainly global history have faced far worse than we are currently facing. So if we look at some of the iconic victories from the last century of our history in this country, all of these movements faced considerably more violence and state repression and vigilante repression than is currently on the horizon right now. Not to minimize what we're currently facing, but it is important to have some historical context here. Scores of workers were murdered in the 1930s. That's just the 1930s. I'm not even going to go back further. The Black freedom struggle in the U.S. South, but in fact throughout the entire country, faced enormous violence from the state and from paramilitaries. Thousands of people, especially Black men, lynched in the period between the Civil War and the period that you see here. And then there's other forms of repression as well. The anti-apartheid movement in South Africa suffered thousands of people killed by state and paramilitary forces over the second half of the 20th century. So all of these movements faced down immense levels of state repression, and they won. And so they should inspire us to show what is possible against authoritarian systems, even when you don't think you have leverage over elected officials. And they also show us how it might be done. So I want to take a quick look at some of the key lessons that I think our movement can learn.
If I can just ask a question.
If it's really quick. Yeah.
How about the Palestinians and what they suffer?
Well, I'll get to that. I'm not counterposing the two.
Because the list three, something similar.
Well, I can list a lot of other examples too. I will come back to that, but I'm not making a distinction. This isn't an all-inclusive list that I'm talking about. Okay. So, what are some of the common strategic ingredients in these three movements that I identified? One is the disruption of business, the disruption of capital, depriving capital of the resources that it needs, primarily labor, money in the form of consumer dollars, and investments into those sectors. This was an essential role. Targeting the state actually was not the primary strategic focus of any of these movements. Secondly, all of these movements were sustained and escalating. The elites don't concede that they think movements are going to fade away quickly. And third, they singled out key strategic targets and targeted them very methodically. And toppling one domino paved the way for others to follow as well. So in the case of the workers' movement in the 1930s, the key piece of legislation here was the National Labor Relations Act, which legalized the right of private sector workers to collective bargaining, have unions. And if we look at the history of this legislation, both its passage in 1935 and its effective implementation, which took several years, were both made possible only by mass strikes in the U.S. economy. There was a big wave of them in 1934, close to 1,900 strikes that year, which played the key role in pushing Congress to pass the legislation in 1935. And then the implementation was only possible after things like the Flint sit-down strike at General Motors plants, which you see in the two right-hand photos there. This was a sustained and escalating movement. It was clear to policymakers that the strikes were spreading. And there was a real elite fear of radicalization. Communists, socialists, and other radicals played a very important role in organizing of these movements. They also singled out key targets. If you go back to the late 20s and early 30s, one of the key targets of the left was the coal industry. So communists played a very important role in organizing the coal industry. And that was actually the foremost center of labor unrest at the beginning of the 1930s, before the rest of the economy started to really pop off. General Motors, as one of the key business targets, toppling General Motors, getting them to concede to unionization, paved the way for the rest to follow. We see a similar pattern, but with different details, in the case of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The disruption of business, primarily in the form of consumer boycotts. The photo that you see here is the notorious police chief of Birmingham, Alabama, directing police to arrest these picketers, calling for the boycott of segregated businesses. And if we look closely at Birmingham, you see that the forces which really spearheaded the desegregation of the city, which was really the bastion of segregation and white supremacy in the country, the forces that spearheaded that at the local level were really the merchants, because they were suffering from the boycotts. They went to the rest of the political establishment and economic elite and demanded that they integrate as a way of ending the disruption. The movement was sustained and escalating. It was clear that in their eyes, the movement was not visible. And there was a real fear of radicalization. If you look at what the Kennedy and Johnson administration officials were saying, they were very afraid that the Black working class in particular would turn toward Malcolm X and radical leaders. And they singled out key targets, particular brands, particular sectors, particular locations. So in the case of Birmingham, a local target, which then helps to set the stage for a national level change. We move forward to anti-apartheid solidarity, solidarity with South Africa. Of course, there was a major long-term movement in South Africa itself, which played really the central role in ending apartheid. But the solidarity movement all over the world and in this country, played a central role in, again, disrupting business, primarily through the withdrawal of consumption and investments. So the divestment movement is often talked about, it's cited as a precedent for today's divestment movements. But actually, even more consequential than that was the municipal level boycotts of corporations that invested in South Africa. If you look at State Department correspondence from the 1980s with corporate CEOs, they say that the municipal level boycotts, the procurement boycotts, were actually the most worrisome piece of what the movement was doing because it potentially deprived them of huge amounts of sales. So this was cities and towns, this was local organizing all across the country that was cited by the CEOs themselves as the most consequential piece. Targeting the banks was also a key piece here. It wasn't, they targeted the banks as the leaders of the financial world. The movement was sustained, it was escalating, actually, even into the 1990s. And they singled out key strategic targets. When Chase Bank decided to effectively cut off credit to South Africa in 1985, that rapidly led other banks to follow suit. So what are some of the applications for the climate fight here? Obviously, the successes of the past can't be mechanically replicated. The climate movement is different, faces a different set of challenges in a lot of ways. But I do think that there are ways that we can learn from these past movements and apply these lessons in a flexible and creative way, even if the lessons are not directly transferable. So I'm going to give a list of 8 things which I think the movement should be prioritizing. These are things that we can still do. Most of them are things we can do from where we are. Most of them are things already being done, including here in Ithaca. Many of you are involved in a lot of these things. It's not an exhaustive list. There's other things we could add, but these are some of the most important things that I think we can do. And they all entail targeting sectors of business and or the state apparatus where we have some potential for leverage. So the federal government is not the central target in most of these. And all of these actions can be thought of as, first of all, reducing the demand for fossil fuels. Second, reducing the production of fossil fuels. Do both of those things. And the industry, by the way, is very worried about that declining demand and impediments to production. So when you block an oil pipeline or you stop a power plant from being built, that threatens the supply of fossil fuels, with long-term consequences for investment in the sector. And third, we're also talking about the need to transform society itself, to simultaneously confront class hierarchy, racial domination, national oppression, imperialism, all of the forces that intertwine so tightly with the climate emergency. Right. So, pressuring large institutions to stop burning fossil fuels. Here I can make note of my institution again, UMass Amherst, as well as Cornell. So big institutions cutting their demand for fossil fuels sends a crucial signal to investors that there's a threat on the horizon. And currently, many leaders in business and in academia are seizing the opportunity to go down burning fossil fuels. So at my campus, UMass Amherst, years ago, they announced this big decarbonization plan. They called it Carbon Zero by 2032 plan. The last year or two, they've quietly started to abandon that. They've stopped using the language of carbon zero. Now they talk about carbon reduction, right? Which could mean anything. It could mean a 1% reduction. Right? Could mean decarbonization over the span of a century. Who knows what it means? And rather than implementing campus electrification, geothermal technology, heat exchanges to transition the campus to renewables, they've come to rely on something called renewable diesel, which is produced from which is produced from feedstocks. We're not exactly sure of all the sources of those feedstocks, but suffice it to say that it's not a real solution. And it would lead to massive deforestation if they're renewable consumption. And they're doing this because of the cost. It's a lot cheaper than convert the existing HVAC system. At Cornell, the campus administration is now doing something similar, but with a different twist, presenting methane gas as a lower carbon alternative. We don't need lower carbon, we need zero carbon. We need it short term. We have the technology, the resources to do it. So again, this is a form of casual collaboration with the Trump administration. So it's a way of concealing the true extent of carbon emissions. We call methane gas a lower carbon option, right? Which may actually not even be true if you look at the life cycle of this production of gas, especially if you convert it to LNG. Now, targeting fossil financial institutions and investment funds is another key piece here, just as they did in the case of the anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s. Finance remains a very important enabler of fossil fuels. The top banks in the world have lent somewhere in the order of $7 trillion to fossil fuel companies over the past decade. So that's a lot of money, even though the fossil fuel companies have a lot of internal revenue that they're generating and they have profits right now, they still do rely to a significant degree on external finance and insurance. So this is where an entity like TIAA could have a lot of potential leverage if it chose to use it. These pension funds across the country control trillions and trillions of dollars in assets. Right? So these are some images of recent movements. Chubb is not a household name, but it's one of the world's leading insurers of fossil fuels. So going after these financial accomplices of the fossil fuel industry is one big thing that we need to do. Right? And we can do a lot of this through the venue of our universities. So at UMass, we've begun to do this. We've begun to identify who those financial accomplices are in the case of our institution. Right? Through our research, we've determined that UMass uses all of these companies, and we're also state employees, participants in the Massachusetts State Pension Fund. So we've begun to identify these. We haven't yet made a lot of headway, but this is one strategy that we're pursuing in conjunction with trying to actually hold the university to its zero carbon commitment. The fight for state and local legislation is incredibly important. As I said, state and level decarbonization can actually get us most of the way toward the Paris climate goals, 2016, and which, by the way, are not sufficient. They were never sufficient, but state and local legislation can get us along a lot of the way there. Obstructing the recruitment pipeline. This is another promising tactic that the movement has begun to deploy, targeting especially the financial institutions to cut off their recruitment pipeline on college campuses. We'll go through the rest of these quickly and then wrap up. So organizing our workplaces. Working people around the world are already bearing most of the costs of the climate crisis, and this is going to get worse. So organizing our workplaces is not, might not seem like it's directly connected with climate, but there are lots of connections. By mid-century, according to a study from last year, the climate crisis may cost the world $38 trillion a year. And who do you think is going to pay those costs? It's not the fossil fuel companies themselves. They're going to externalize those costs. So organizing as a labor movement is essential for forcing them to bear more of the costs of their activities. Right? In addition to helping workers confront dangerous situations of heat levels in the workplace and all the rest. And of course, if we build the labor movement strong enough, we can begin to take collective action that makes a bigger difference. Anti-imperialist solidarity is also essential. And here we can mention several different dimensions. Solidarity with climate refugees helps to weaken the appeal of the right. The far right is utterly dependent on the vilification We also have to bring in Palestine solidarity here, the elephant in the room. Now, in addition to the carbon emissions from the war itself, which got some attention over the past year or so, the deeper connection, I think, is really why the United States is in the Middle East in the first place, and it's oil. There are domestic lobbies, yes, but it's ultimately about control over oil. The U.S. State Department and the National Security Council identified this long ago, that in order to secure oil, it requires strong alliance with Israel and with the Arab dictatorships. Lawsuits, I think that's obvious. There are still some opportunities where lawsuits can make a difference. I don't need to go into detail there. And lastly, talk about it with new people. That might not seem like a really big thing, but like I said before, 2/3 of the public rarely or never talks about climate in their daily lives. Raising public consciousness and keeping this at the forefront of people's minds undergirds all of these other tactics. It undergirds our ability to carry out all of these other tactics. Right? So UC San Diego is one university that has taken some promising action because of organizing on the campus, not at the initiative of the administration itself. The recent article I recommend that talks about that, and actually references you all. All right, and just to wrap up, this is a protracted war. We will lose some battles. We're losing some battles now. We are losing the war overall. But everything that we do in this fight matters. And we can't forget that, right? We don't have the luxury of withdrawing from the fight. That would be an act of extreme cowardice under the circumstances. We need to remember that everything that we do does make a difference. Thanks.
So, having a resolution, made a case for why direct action is necessary. And historical evidence is quite clear. We need mass disruptive action to ensure environmental protections, human rights, and the freedoms that we enjoy. And in fact, we only enjoy freedoms. The audience is not before us, not aggression. Right. At this moment, everything we value, including life itself on Earth, is under attack. Action is needed. As scientists, scholars, and students who follow the evidence, we must now follow the historical evidence to engage in direct action ourselves. And I see a couple of questions. These will be answered during the direct action, and you can also come and speak to us in person. We don't have a Q&A for this question. We do have to keep moving, but we will welcome your question live in front of Day Hall in a moment. So we do want to emphasize that direct action isn't something we can simply talk about, which is what academics are very good at doing. It is something we must do. And we thought it would be hypocritical of us to invite you here today to talk about direct action without doing something. So at this moment, we will invite you all to join us for collective direct action just across the street in front of Day Hall. And this is why. Cornell activists have done our research, and we have exposed extensive ties to the fossil fuel industry and the military industrial complex here at Cornell, across all sectors of the university, including research, donations, building names, the board of trustees, the gas plant, and beyond. This is not acceptable. We are living in a time of urgency, and we're the only ones alive on Earth who can take action. We must demand a fossil-free degree of Cornell University. So, as you know, the MCCs in this auditorium represent everyone who has never received a fossil-free degree from Cornell. We have only received degrees soaked in oil, gas, land grabs, indigenous dispossession, and conflicts of interest. But today, we have an opportunity to change that. We will hold our own commencement ceremony in front of the hall of all of you. We will celebrate activists during our inviting them fossil free, and we will confer a fossil federal degree the senior colleagues. At the same time, we will send a senior delegation of our activists to confer a resolution for fossil fuel association to senior leadership inside Day Hall. Now, all of you are invited to join us. This will be a 15-minute peaceful action that follows all the rules. It will be completely non-hostile. It is fully supported by our two illustrious speakers, also supported by Cornell faculty, whom you will recognize by their graduation hats. Thank you. Pardon? Oh, well, we're almost do you know that this is intended as the holding of our actions? And it is common for Cornell police to come to large gatherings to ensure safety. They have police liaisons, they're wearing white masks. So in one moment, we're going to invite you to be spontaneous, even if you didn't plan for this, to spontaneously follow the evidence and take direct action with us. And a very beautiful, safe, and ceremonious celebration of activism in front of Day Hall. Oh, you can go back to work if you feel so compelled. So as you walk out the door, we will wrap up by 12:20 as advertised. As you walk out the door, someone will give you your own fossil-free degree. This degree is in gratitude for your action today. It is a sign of gratitude that you have the courage to walk out with us into this action. And it is also part of our action. So you can hold up your fossil-free degree as a symbol of what we are asking for today. So please rise at this moment, gather your things, and follow the banner as we march across the street to Day Hall. Thank you. Day Hall.
Are they coming with the van? Thank you. Just here. Okay. Okay. Maybe if you go. Okay, thanks. Do you know where this is? I'm guessing. I'm guessing. Yeah. What's it say? Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Drake. No fossil fuels. Here we have Sam. We're just getting ready. If you can all gather in a circle, that would be excellent. Kind of come towards one side. Good afternoon, everyone. To publicly call out the ability to break free from the federalism.